Hello, thank you for joining the IBM NES MicroStrategies webinar on the anatomy of a data breach. My name is Jennifer Ely Carter, and I will be hosting today's event. Joining me is Steve Farouk, cybersecurity architect at IBM. Steve is responsible for architecting security solutions that harness the power of IBM's security portfolio and IBM Watson. He educates clients on the ever-evolving threat landscape and maps out security controls necessary to improve security posture. And prior to joining IBM, Steve has worked at Bay Systems, RSA, and PricewaterhouseCoopers. He holds his master's in technology management from Columbia University, and he is a certified information systems security professional. Before I pass it over to Steve, I'd just like to set the stage with some interesting facts and thoughts regarding data breaches in 2016. This year has shown us a lot. Data breaches are becoming more frequent, more damaging, and we're seeing that it's impacting all facets of society. Financial services companies like Scottrade and Charles Schwab have been hit. Healthcare and life science organizations such as Quest Diagnostics, which just announced yesterday, in fact, that the health data of 34,000 customers has been exposed. Even local governments, Madison County experienced a profound ransomware attack that left major departments inoperable for 6 days. The police, firefighters, and court officials all had to log calls by hand until the county finally paid to get access restored. And of course, everyone has heard the news lately about how hackers deployed by the Russian government broke into email servers at the DNC and stole emails from senior members of Hillary Clinton's campaign staff. So I would say that the resounding message of 2016 is that breaches are not going away. And to borrow a line from Brian Krebs of Krebs on Security, there are really two types of organizations now, those that have suffered a breach and those that don't know it yet. So with that ominous backdrop, let's get started. Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thanks everyone for taking a few minutes today to join us for our Anatomy of a Breach webinar. If you listen to the news, with all the breaches coming out on a monthly basis, if not weekly, you'll be convinced that the bad guys are winning. When it comes to cybersecurity, if you're a good guy fighting to keep the bad guys out, you might find yourself at a disadvantage. It's similar to a soldier who was asked to hold down the fort. However, he has no idea what the enemy looks like, when and from where they will strike, whether they're marching in on foot or rolling in on tanks. All they have is an old rifle because this year's budget didn't have money for the automatic weapons. Knowing your enemy has its advantages. Unless you know your enemy, as a Chinese general once said, you will only have about 50% chance of winning. Can you really live with that kind of odds? So what we intend to do today is give you a sense of what your adversary looks like, shed light on the shadowy character that you see on the screen right now, in attempt to give you a better understanding of how to navigate and launch an attack. It turns out that there is a method to their madness, a methodology that they follow to be most effective. Chances are, if you know their methodology, you'll be better equipped to defend yourself. Jennifer, I want to take a pause and ask you if you can hear me okay.
I can hear you just fine, Steve. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. So with that in mind, this is what we have planned for today's webinar. We will start with the latest breach data, dissect a few of them to learn how they occurred. In fact, I will only touch on a couple that push new frontiers, not just the typical data exfiltration that we have become numb to. Then we will proceed to the attack vectors used to stage the attacks, and finally we will look at the methodology used by the malicious actors and develop a framework so you can arm yourself against breaches. So all in all, we want to give you a framework for defense so you'll be better equipped. But we feel that unless and until you know your enemy, you will not be in that position. And last two items include Watson for Cybersecurity. There, we will have this focus on cognitive computing to show you how you can harness the power of Watson to detect cyber attacks. And lastly, we will review a recent attack vector, ransomware, which has become top of mind in multiple sectors, including healthcare, to give you guys some tips on how to protect yourself against it. So with that in mind, let's start. First, let's take a look at the breaches. If you are like me, you probably travel along the East Coast, perhaps cross country. So even though we are in the United States or whichever country we are, a lot of our day we spend actually on social media sites, including Facebook. All of us, I can bet $100 that have a LinkedIn profile. And some of us also are active on Twitter. Being on some of these sites exposes us to attack vectors more than we know, because we may not know our adversary, but they take a lot of time and perform recon to get to know us, their target, that then help them stage a more effective attack that we will cover in a minute. So it's important to watch our steps, so to speak, as we divulge information about ourselves. And this is not to discourage you to share. There is also the aspect of collaborating with your colleagues, because bad guys and bad actors, they collaborate quite a bit, and that's partly why they're so successful. So we need to do the same, but at the same time, we need to understand how recon can be done against us to gather information that could be used for an attack. Today, we are not faced with the same attacks that were predominant even 5 years ago. It's not just our personal computers or servers that are the target. Now we are increasingly seeing mobile devices, and Internet of Things come to mind. If you draw your attention to the DDoS attack that took place, I believe, on October 21st, and I know that because I was in the process of actually having a similar event, Anatomy of a Breach, in San Francisco on November 3rd. So I was setting up a registration website for that event, only to find out that I couldn't even access that website anymore. It was down along with probably dozens of other websites. And then I started researching it. At that point, there wasn't a lot of information, and I came to realize that it was a result of a very successful DDoS attack that brought down a good chunk of the internet during that time frame. And that was related to the DIN attack, DDoS attack. And if you look at some of the backstory of that, and this is interesting, you know, much like Mr. Robot, right? There are all these various entities at war with each other, and they are trying to take, you know, territory back and forth. And a lot of the regular guys are actually falling a victim to that. So Brian Krebs, who Jennifer quoted a minute ago, was responsible for exposing a couple of these guys from Tel Aviv who came up with this novel approach of DDoS for hire. So essentially, you could pay them a fee and use their infrastructure to stage a DDoS attack against someone that may have wronged you in some manner. So Brian Krebs exposes them, but so they were not happy about it. So they came back with a more elaborate attack, which actually manifested, you know, using these some of the webcams. So webcams was not really used prior to that in a significant manner to stage an attack. if you look at some of the IoT devices, they're not really very secure, partly because they're so new. And so now that we kind of have invested time and effort to lock down our Wi-Fi routers, if you will, although it's not always the case, we actually spend no time, or some of the manufacturers don't really spend any time in locking down some of their IoT devices, because often people don't even consider them to be part of the cybersecurity infrastructure. Yet they use an IP address, yet they can still be used to take advantage of that IP address and turn them into bot and stage an attack, like the one that we saw with DIN1. Last year, there was a demonstration that was widely publicized by Wired, among other publications, where an attacker was able to take control of a Grand Cherokee. Using a flaw in their infotainment system, they were able to completely take control of the vehicle to the point that they could veer that vehicle off the road. Just think about this. This is not only our data that's at stake, it's our very life. You are driving down I-95 at 70 miles an hour, and if someone can take control of your car, just imagine the catastrophe that they can cause for you and your family. Now, with that said, let's look at some numbers. And Jennifer, I will look to you. If you don't see the slides transitioning, or if you don't hear me clearly, please stop and let me know so I can take actions to correct that. Okay.
We're good, Steve. We can see everything. Thank you. Excellent.
So here, there are two numbers that you can see on the slide. Average time to detect APT is 256 days. And then you see average cost of a US data breach, according to Ponemon study that was done this year, 2016, that states that it's around 7.1 million. So there are two metrics that I will draw your attention to. One is the mean time to identify an attack, which is clearly much higher than we would like to be. And then mean time to contain. If we cannot get a better handle on mean time to identify and contain, we will be faced with enormous cost of a data breach, such as the $7 million that you see here. And what is it that's causing some of these breaches? Attack types can be any of the variety that you see on this. A couple that we talked about already, DDoS. We will talk about another one, ransomware, that are becoming more top of mind. But cross-site scripting or SQL injection, those are still there. And ironic as it may be, some brute force or just misconfiguration still contribute to a significant portion of the attacks, the successful ones as well. So what we are here to do is very simple, and I would like to keep it simple. There are two things essentially. One is the initial attack to initial compromise. Right now, to our disadvantage, it's taking attackers minutes to hours to infiltrate. We want that to be in months and years. And conversely, we want to be able to discover and contain some of these attacks in minutes and hours, which currently is taking us months to a year, 256 days to be precise, as you saw in the slide before. And this is the name of the game. This is all we are trying to do. We want to lower mean time to identify and contain an attack and make it difficult enough so that it will take them months, if not years, to be able to infiltrate. And I'll give you guys a couple of frameworks that could come in handy in your attempt to do so. Next, let's take a look at what is it, which sectors are vulnerable. some of you might be associated or work in healthcare. Some of you might be in financial services or manufacturing, information technology, so on and so forth. In 2015, healthcare took the top spot. They knocked down financial services to have the highest incident rates. Let me take a pause and define two concepts, because we will repeatedly talk about them, right? So there's the incident and there's the breach. And let's define the incident first. Incident is a security event that compromises the integrity, confidentiality, or availability of an information asset valuable to an enterprise. Then there is the breach, which is an incident that results in the confirmed disclosure of data to an authorized party. And our express goal is to contain an incident so that it does not become a breach. With that said, let's take you to a live site that IBM Research, known as X-Force, provides. There we can actually look at some of the live data, because I realized that this slide has data from 2014 and 15, but we want to take a look at what's happening in 2016. So I'll stop sharing for a second and then take you to a live website. All right, at this point, you should be able to see a Firefox screen where we are showing you the breaches that took place in 2016, represented by bubbles. Jennifer, you were able to see them, right?
Yes, we can see the screen. Thank you, Steve.
Okay, sure. So interestingly, this actually breaks it down by industry and also attack type. So if you join me here as I kind of go through various parts of the screen. Up top, you see all the bubbles, and you can go to the bubble to get a sense of what that entails. So I just hovered over a purple bubble, right? Actually, go to this one here. This is probably one of the most recent ones. It talks about a breach that resulted in 8 million records that were leaked. It gives you the reason attributed to the data breach. It says misconfiguration or human error. So that still contributes significantly, as you can see. And it gives you further information on how a misconfigured NoSQL database was the cause of this leak here. And that aggregates public LinkedIn data, exposed millions of people's personal information, and so on, right? And this was actually in, I want to say, in the computer industry. So you can go to all these various bubbles and learn more about some of these breaches. I am filtering this by United States, but you could go global as well, because you see now the United States flag is highlighted here. Then you can filter this further by your industry. So since we saw healthcare shooting to the top, let's filter by that right here. That will only leave the bubbles associated with healthcare. And in fact, I think this year healthcare is actually in better shape than last year. So you can filter that by industry, as you can see, and then you could also go to the left-hand side, the pie chart, and see what type of attack. So DDoS, we talked about it. So let's take a look at all the DDoS attacks. So this one was computer services industry, happened October 21st. That's the one that I was talking about. But that's not the only DDoS attack. You can see a number of others throughout the year that took place. I can reset that, and let's take a look at some of the other ones, like SQL injection, for instance. Then you've got two that took place, healthcare industry and healthcare industry again. All right, so that gives you a sense of, this, where you can go to research breaches, learn from them, and so on and so forth. And Jen, we can probably share this, this URL for their research.
Yes, I will be sending everybody a follow-up email with the slide deck and the URLs.
Okay. Now, next up, let's take a look at another website. This one is, again, X-Force Exchange. This gives you a global view of threat as it's evolving. You see some of these IP addresses through the scrolling bar across the top, and you could quickly get a sense of which IP addresses are being used from where to stage attacks. You could also then type in any IP addresses or MD5 hashes that you come across in your daily threat hunting experience and learn quickly more about them. And I could show you guys, as far as the trending, this IP address is becoming very popular, and you could go and take a look at whether this is still a malicious IP address, how it was used, and so on and so forth. Another quick way to get some good intel is by going to this dashboard. And this gives you up to the minute information on the latest vulnerabilities that you can see on the right-hand side. What's being top of mind, what is taking place out in the wild. You can go to this one dashboard and learn about them. Alongside, you can get research materials from our blog and others. So for example, Mirai was used for the DDoS attack, and you can see if that is a concern for you guys, you can click on this and get information or more information about how that's being used here, and go down to pretty technical depth as far as URLs, the files that are being used, config files, and so on and so forth. All right. All right. So now let's go back to our slide deck. So I'll stop sharing at this point and take you back to the slide deck and continue with the rest of the presentation. So you will see for 1 second it will disappear, and then until I take you back to the slide deck. Okay, so this is where we left off. Next up, now that we have a better understanding of some of the attacks, let's look at the motivations. And this is becoming increasingly important. You heard Jennifer mention before that it's not just the enterprises. Now we are seeing cyber attacks trying to meddle with our election process. We learned that DNC was hacked, and if you research that, you will find out that there were groups like Fancy Bear or APT28 that were attributed to some of launching some of those attacks. So it's not just typical hacktivism or even cybercrime. I think that we are increasingly seeing cyber warfare type activities there. But vast majority, and probably most relevant, are still cybercrime or cyber criminals, as represented here by the blue part of this circle here. And these guys are criminals. They're organized. They're increasingly more effective because they collaborate with each other. They use each other's infrastructure and recon intel that they uncover, and some of it is they sell to each other so they can actually take advantage of economies of scale. Whereas we actually, the good guys, are not as we don't collaborate as much as the bad guys. So we need to do more of that, and that's one of the things that we try to provide through some of the portals that the portal that I showed you, by sharing some of those intel and research materials as we uncover them through X-Force research. So the next section of today's presentation, let's look at attack vectors and how is it that these malicious actors still targeting us, finding information and using that information effectively to infiltrate. Here is an example of a LinkedIn profile. I have a LinkedIn profile and I'm sure you do too. But as you guys are connecting to people, I think that it might be worthwhile for you to be aware, who this person is before you connect. So here's an example of a cyber threat analyst who actually was able to connect to 300 plus people here in the intelligence community of all communities, in the military sector. And she was able to actually not only connect to those people, she was able to form connections and relationships to them that resulted in job offers, dinner invites, of course, emails, and even some bank account offers from, from like community banks, and so on and so forth. And some of them allegedly shared very secret information like secret base locations and so on as they were trying to impress this woman. So just think about the implication of every connection that you make in LinkedIn. Just some food for thought. Now, we talked about Wi-Fi routers being, more secure than before. Yes, that's probably true. But often we go to a very secure facility, in this case, a SOC, right? That is responsible for, you see a media entertainment company is named there. I should have probably taken that out. But right up front, their Wi-Fi password is, written on the board. While they are monitoring all these various, activities, malicious and otherwise, coming in and infiltrating their enterprise, their Wi-Fi password is right on the board for everybody to share. So we need to get better at some of these, best practices, if you will, because unless we get better at it, chances are we will have that human element that will always come back and bite us. This is an example of a remote access Trojan that you guys may have seen. Point here is that no development skills necessary for anybody to stage an attack. They could get a rat like this for $69.99 that comes with SLA, that comes with support contract, and an 800 number that an aspiring malicious actor can call if they don't know how to use this to infect others. So here you see a good, solid user interface that could be used to virtually control a machine after it's been infected. And then the same interface could be used to transfer password through keyloggers, as well as remotely control any desktops or laptops that have been compromised. And all at a cost of $69.99. So with that said, let's go back to what we started talking about framework, right? So we said, okay, our express goal is to lower the time it takes to infiltrate the target system for a bad actor, right? So from initial attack to initial compromise, we want that to be in minutes, not in months. then we said we want to, and a couple of things that can help you are understanding how is it that the bad actors navigate. And also, as you choose some of your threat protection tools, as well as methodology, then there comes the incident response. We want to discover and contain an attack in minutes, and as we respond to an incident, as we come to know about it. And there, it's important for you to understand how is it that the bad actor is actually launching an attack. So they in fact follow a method or a framework, and this could be seen evident by multiple attacks that have taken place. So they typically perform their recon, as I said, using social media and other places before they break in. And they break in typically, through phishing attacks and others to gain access, after which they latch on. And at that point, their target computer is compromised. And then they go on to expand as they gather information and pivot to more like a richer, targets. So they could come in through an employee laptop, compromised laptop, and then they could pivot to servers that contain your intellectual property. It could be your patient PHI information. It could be PII information of your customers, and then they go on to exfiltrate that. So this follows a specific pattern that starts with recon, as you can see at the bottom, and that goes on to weaponization, delivery exploit, as well as C2 and exfiltration. So the bottom one is actually was popularized by Lockheed Martin with the definition of the kill chain. And the one that you see up top is an IBM's attack chain that's a little more simplified, but it's still basically the same concept here. So as you investigate incidents, keep this in mind and try to trace it back to the specific stages of that attack. How is it that the break-in happened? How is it that they latched on and then expanded? So if you come across a break-in scenario, keep that in mind, that might not be the ultimate target. They might, after latching on, they might pivot to another more, richer target area, and you might be looking at further and more devastating damage than just, a couple of employee laptops being hacked. Now that we know a little bit about how they follow a 5-stage attack chain, let's take a look at what can you do to make it more difficult for them. Here is a pyramid, often called a pyramid of pain. And the name comes from the fact that if you follow this pyramid, you will find a way to make it increasingly difficult for your adversary to break in or going from break-in to exfiltration. And the goal here is for you to identify the indicators of compromise and focus on the ones that are most effective in making an attack more difficult for them. So if you start at the bottom, which we often do, you've got IP addresses and hash values. And those are a good place to start. And you could take a bunch of IP addresses and hash values and start blacklisting them in your tools. And that will be a good starting point. But keep that in mind that they now have a way to move on very quickly from IP address to IP address. And IP address is actually fairly cheap, disposable tool for them, as they are constantly compromising and converting machines to botnets and taking those IP addresses to stage attacks. So you might want to dig deeper or move further up in this pyramid. That might include network artifacts, domain names. Domain names make it a little more difficult because they have to pay usually to get control of the domain names. Then there are tools and TTPs. So TTPs are techniques, tactics, and protocols, which signify essentially their playbook. So believe it or not, they too have a playbook on how to stage a successful attack, very much like you might have like an incident response playbook. If you don't, you definitely should look into it. Now, if you can learn more of the behavior or the playbook that they are following to stage an attack, you will make it much more difficult for them and costly for them to change their behavior. It takes them very little effort and money to move from one IP to another, but it takes them much more to abandon a technique that they have become good at and go to a different technique altogether. So if you could go up this pyramid and follow that attack chain that we talked about and bring the two together, that's where you start having a good, effective framework in making it more difficult for them. So this kind of brings the two together essentially, whereby we are focusing on specific choke points. So as they are moving from pre-exploit to data exfiltration throughout the attack chain, we too are focused on how can we make it more difficult. So, and focus on some of these strategic points. So malware delivery is one, you've got execution of the content, and then establish communication channels. So for instance, often in many of the attack vectors, so we can take one such as ransomware, after they infiltrated a target environment, they need to establish a communication back to the command and control center. So now, as you know that, if you could stop that communication from happening, you can break that attack chain for it to go forward. So that's one thing to think about, how you could get, focus on some of these strategic choke points and thwart them from progressing throughout this attack lifecycle. So next, let's take a look at what is it that we can do differently as we perform our threat research and turn it into incident response. One area we are seeing more and more is the machine learning aspect of it, whereby we are kind of coming to terms that we alone cannot research all the threat intel that's out there. And that is sort of the premise where we are saying that if we could take advantage of artificial intelligence, that would really make sense for us to be more effective. So as you probably have seen ever since IBM Watson appeared in Jeopardy, it went on to not only winning Jeopardy against its human competitors, but also it's being leveraged to find cure for cancer, predict weather patterns, as well as model financial portfolios. But what about cybersecurity? As we were saying, cybersecurity is one front where we almost feel like the good guys are losing, but perhaps that's because the good guys are not taking advantage of all the threat intel that's out there and collaborating as much as the bad guys. So let's take a close look here. 90% of all the threat data that exists today in the world is human generated. They exist in the realm of unstructured data, which today's traditional threat management systems simply don't understand. So what kind of data are we talking about? This year, 2.7 million pages of security research is published. 2,000 security blogs are out there with all these threat data. Yet all of our tools are completely blind to them. Unless you can put them in a log event that these tools can parse, it's pretty much useless. So that's where cognitive security comes in, because it can go through this enormous amount of data very, very quickly and learn from it. What kind of scale are we talking about? I'll give you an example. IBM Watson was used at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, where oncologists were trying to identify a new strain or type of cancer. So they wanted a second opinion because they were struggling with it. So they asked Watson about its diagnosis, and Watson came back in 17 seconds after having gone through 3,500 textbooks and 417,000 medical journals. Just think about that for a minute. How long would it take for medical researchers and doctors to have gone through that many numbers of textbooks and medical research journals? Same applies to cybersecurity. Watson has the ability to go through those 2.7 million pages of security research that I mentioned in seconds, and it learns from it as it goes through it. So it doesn't have to process all that information every time you ask it a new question. It learns and also it reasons through hundreds of algorithms that it has in its disposal. So how is it that Watson learns? It takes thousands of books, reports, and other threat research data that could exist in the form of exposed threat analysis that I walked you through before, IP reputation database, fraud analytics, client data sources, and also the research, unstructured research such as dark reading, Brian Krebs, and other blog entries that might exist out there. And it starts taking that into its corpus and creates a cybersecurity corpus that then it can tap into to identify bad actors. There is also a learning process that it goes through as it creates that corpus of knowledge. Watson, at this stage, begins to annotate relevant data that has been provided by security experts. It builds index and other metadata to make working with this data more efficient. It may also start building out knowledge graphs, similar to what you see, what Google does as it's, indexing and crawling data. So here, there is a representation of how annotation works in the Watson world. This is an example of quarterly threat index that IBM X-Force Research publishes. So we take that, for instance, and start annotating to teach Watson what each of these words could mean in the cybersecurity language. So on the right-hand side, you see legends, right? So you've got indicator of compromise, threat actors, TTPs, course of action campaigns, and so on and so forth. So it learns that ransomware is a type of campaign that could also be done via malvertising. It is a part of crypto ransomware, most of these ransomwares that you see, that proceeds to encrypt data and hold the machine hostage until a ransom is paid. Now, much like a new cybersecurity analyst, Watson is learning. The only thing is that Watson never forgets anything, and it learns and it gets better every time it goes through an article like this and annotation process. And then it can then build that corpus and comes back to it in a matter of seconds, not having to go through that whole entire article and learning process again. So what does it mean for you? Think about a day in the life of your stock analyst. He starts his day by looking at an incident, review the events that created the incident, expand the search, goes to search websites such as VirusTotal or X-Force to identify the indicators of compromise, malware threat name, identifiers, hashes, takes them back and searches for them in the internal network to identify infected machines, and other things like IPs, and start an incident response process. Often it takes weeks or months to do that, which contributes to the attackers staying in the target network. And we talked about being 256 days before they're detected and remediated. With the help of Watson, this can be reduced to minutes from months. And that is the value of Watson for cybersecurity. This really helps us meet or achieve our goal that we set in the beginning of the session, whereby we said that we want the mean time to identify an incident and contain it to be in minutes, not months. And that is where Watson kind of comes in. At this point, I want to take a quick pause and do a time check. Jennifer, we have 10 more minutes. Is that right?
That's correct.
So the two things we have left are, number one, ransomware, and then go into a quick, Q&A and perhaps an overview of what NES, MicroStrategy, and IBM provide in this space, and how can we have a further dialogue. So I will look to you, Jennifer, whether we want to cover ransomware or we should do a follow-up session and go into a Q&A and the solution session.
So why don't we see if there are some questions right now, and depending on the number of questions, we can do a high level of ransomware. I mean, it's such a big concern and issue, especially we've seen this past year. I referenced that ransomware case just this past November, Madison County. So I think it is relevant, but let's just pause for a minute and see if we've got any questions coming in. I think we can proceed, Steve.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so ransomware is becoming top of mind, as Jennifer just mentioned. So let's take a closer look at what it entails. This attack vector, how is it that this attack is staged, and what are we seeing out there? So to define it, it's a type of malicious software that uses actually slightly different than other malware. Typically, we see a lot of malware, they come in under the cover and follow a low and slow approach to stay undetected. Not ransomware, though. Ransomware comes in, and after the initial compromise, it's right in your face. It will be right there in front of you, holding you hostage or holding your machine hostage or data hostage until you pay a ransom. And typically these are called crypto ransomware. And we're seeing the average demand for ransom has doubled in 2016 to about $680, which actually went up from $294 that we saw in the previous year. And it's a very lucrative business. as evidenced from the net revenue one variant was able to generate, crypto wall, that amounted to about 325 million only within the span of a year. You can see on the left-hand side, it follows a 5-stage process, similar to what we talked about in our attack chain section. It installs maybe because the user clicked on a wrong link, or perhaps opened an attachment, not unlike in a lot of other malware attack vectors. Then it needs to contact the command and control center. And that's how it gets the key, and the handshake of keys take place, after which encryption starts. After the data is encrypted, they could then take it offline, and it doesn't only limit it. It does not only limit to the victim's machine. If the victim logs into a Windows share, for example, it can then propagate to the Windows share and proceed to encrypt that Windows share as well. And we have seen, especially in the healthcare vertical, this could wreak havoc. So let's take a look at a couple of major variants. Locky is probably the most widely used one. It's called Locky partly because it changes the extension to Locky, or Zepto is the other extension that we see. It mimics banking Trojan Dridex, and in fact, it's probably the same cyber criminals are behind both Trojan Dridex as well as Locky. And one of the interesting things about Locky is that it can remove shadow copy functionality on Windows, so that your Windows, it basically disables the built-in backup mechanism that Windows rely on for, that could be used to thwart such an attack. A couple of others: CryptoWall, CTB Locker, Tesla Script that we see often. Tesla Script is no longer really relevant because massive decryption key was released recently. And then you've got CTB Locker that targets people that are trying to upgrade to Windows 10. And then CryptoWall is the other one that we talked about that have generated a ton of revenue that spreads by drive-by downloads and so on. As a business, you need to understand the business impact to be ready for ransomware. And it's not just the operational impact that's at stake here. Sure, it will. You guys will face downtime to deal with infection and then roll back to old backups. But there are a couple of things that are important to understand. One of which is recovery point objective. Whenever you guys have a backup, you need to understand the business impact of setting a recovery point, and how far back can you roll back, and how much does it cost to your business? What is the impact of that? And you need to take that into your ransomware readiness plan. And then there is the financial impact, of course, that includes incident response costs, legal bills, notification costs, and so on and so forth. And if you are in a regulated sector, that might include regulatory fines. But there are those intangible costs that include brand or reputational damage, customer loyalty, public trust. It could also be intellectual property loss that could lead to competitive disadvantage. So all those things come into play. And we actually have a workshop that we designed for ransomware readiness that kind of take into consideration all these various things and help you with a methodology, if you will, that follows the attack chain. So we talked about the break-in, latch on, and so on and so forth. So here, what we're doing is we're mapping a set of controls to that attack chain specific to ransomware. With that said, I will actually hand it over to Jennifer to kind of walk us through some of the security solutions that we have in place for ransomware and other security attacks.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for that excellent overview of anatomy of a data breach. And I know we only have a few minutes left here, and I'm certainly sensitive to everybody's time. NES and MicroStrategies are close security partners with IBM, and we work with our clients to understand essentially how we can improve your overall security program and posture and move from what we've seen typically organizations be more focused on compliance and how they can embrace a risk-based posture. Specifically, some of those services that we've offered include pen testing, vulnerability management. Recently, we've been doing a lot of assessments around security controls reviews. So we'd be happy to schedule time with you and go through those reviews and those controls based on SANS and NIST and help understand where you have vulnerabilities and how either policies or solutions can be employed to help shore up those gaps so that you can be more secure. We also would be happy to talk with you about Watson for cybersecurity. And for those customers that are based in the New England area, you may have heard that IBM recently opened a state-of-the-art first commercial cyber range, which is based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It also happens to be the headquarters for IBM Global Security. And so we would be more than happy to schedule some time in that cyber range and test things with you. So at this point, I think I'd like to just open it up for any last minute questions. I know we've got like a minute to go. Does anyone have a question for either myself or for Steve? Okay, well, I think with that, I'll pass it back over to you, Steve, for some closing thoughts. I will be sending out a copy of this deck as well as some of the relevant URLs for your reference, and I'll be reaching out to you as well going forward. And thank you, Steve.
Not a problem. I hope this past 1 hour was helpful in shedding some light on this shadowy character that you see on the screen now. Hopefully you have started to see how is it, what they look like in the sense that how they operate, how they are targeting, how they're staging an attack, and then going through the attack chain, how is it that they're trying to break in and expand and exfiltrate. We hold some of these, these webinars, but also we hold them on site to give you guys a demonstration of how an actual attack occurs and what tools might be effective against each stages of those attack chains. So we welcome an opportunity for us to go on site and have a face-to-face discussion and dig deeper into some of these attack vectors, such as the ransomware and DDoS and so on and so forth. So, and another thing I want to say is that in Q1, in the new year, which is right around the corner, one thing we're doing is do a similar webinar and also on-site presentation on insider threat, which is becoming more top of mind. So, so stay tuned. We might, we will invite you guys as we plan for that webinar as well. But all in all, I really wanted to thank you for joining us today, and hopefully you learned a thing or two as you go back to tackling the cyber attacks that you encounter every week, if not every day.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you all for joining us today, and enjoy your afternoon. Thank you.